Okay, hi everyone. It's great to see you, both online and here in person. My name is Jack Green. I'm the Jeffrey Carole and Rodney Rose Director and Chief Curator here at the Richard and Carole Cox Art Museum. And you're joining us for this spotlight tour. This is about 20 minutes where we'll be talking about one of the objects in our collection. And I've got a fascinating story to share with you today. It's about this object here. It's actually two objects because it's a couple of fragments of a column from ancient Egypt. And it is from the reign of Akhenaten, also known as Amenhotep IV, the so-called heretic pharaoh of the Amarna period in Egypt. So he reigned in around the middle of the 14th century BCE. So I'll be talking about this object, but also I'll be talking a little bit about some of the object's history in terms of how it was discovered and also its ownership history or provenance. And sometimes that's very important to consider when we're talking about museum objects, particularly ancient objects that we don't always know the precise origin story for. This has got a really interesting story because it's a kind of rediscovery about where it's come from. I'll be telling you a little bit about that. But let's first of all just take a little bit of a look at the object itself. I'm just going to grab my iPad over here. So I've got a few pictures to help us as well through this. So you can probably see this obviously in person here. This is a bit more of a clearer picture here. But just to describe what this object is and what it does show, it shows the bottom half of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten, and he's in a kind of striding position, and he's walking towards what is a stone vase that you can see here the top of on this other part of the column fragment. And this is also next to some what appears to have lotus flowers inside. This was a common kind of religious offering or ritual offering in ancient Egypt. And this is dating to the time of the New Kingdom. And in this particular period, there's a slightly different tradition, artistic tradition that comes across in the Amarna period. And what you see are these hands coming down, and some of them are still they still have red pigment on them as well. And they're reaching down from what would have been a kind of winged disc, a solar disc that represented the Aten, which was the deity that Akhenaten and his family and that dynasty worshipped at that time. It was a break of traditions with previous periods in Egypt, and it was a fairly short-lived one, but it's one in which this sun disk, this solar disk, the Aten, and the rays of that solar disk would extend out, and it's as if those hands are receiving the offerings. So this offering is being given to the Aten by the pharaoh, and also very likely his family members as well. And I will just show you an example of a full-scale example from Tuna El Gebel in Egypt, which shows the Pharaoh Akhenaten here, and the winged sun disk here, and the rays coming down with the hands, and also the offerings. And then behind him is his wife, the Nefertiti. And behind there are a couple of his children as well. So we can imagine that there are actually, and we know there are the fragments of columns that have Nefertiti as well in procession behind the king Akhenaten. So they were there together. So what about this column fragment, and where did it come from? How do we have it at our museum? Well, it's a really interesting story. So This column fragment, which is made, it's made of stone, and it was. We know now that it comes from the ancient site of Amarna, but it was given to the museum by Walter Farmer. Walter Farmer was a very important founder donor of the Art Museum back in the 1960s and 1970s. So he was an alum of Miami University, 1935, and he became pretty well known and famous from his exploits at the very end of World War II as one of the monuments men. And so he was in occupied Germany at that time, and he was able to help salvage a lot of art that had been seized by the Nazis, or was under threat at the time, at the end of the war, and they needed to gather these artworks as a collecting point in Wiesbaden, which he was the head of at that time, in 1946, 1945 to 1946. He was also involved in the creation of the Wiesbaden Manifesto, which was an important document that was a protest against the United States taking artworks from Germany and bringing them to the United States at that time, at the very end of World War II. That is another story, but he was very instrumental in his work in ensuring that those artworks would eventually be returned to Germany, and rather than being treated as spoils of war. So from the standpoint of art, whether it's ancient or contemporary or from any other period of time, Walter Farmer played a really key role in helping to preserve art and also to restitute that art after times of conflict. But also he was a collector of art, and we know that he collected art of all different types and kinds from as early as the 1930s, when he was presumably still a student, or even before then, and also in his time when he was an interior decorator. So he went on after Miami University. He taught art courses, but also he was an interior decorator or designer based in Cincinnati, and he also collected art. Eventually, he was going to go on to donate a lot of that art to this museum, including a large number of ancient objects, and you can see a selection of them here along this case, but we can also see the example of the ancient Egyptian column fragments. That was just one of the items that he had collected and donated to this museum in 1978. Now, unfortunately, Walter Farmer didn't keep a lot of records about exactly how he had acquired some of these objects, but we know that he was purchasing items from art dealers and antiquities dealers over the years, and we just don't always have the receipts or the documents that go with them. So it was a particularly interesting finding when we started looking at more detail of this particular object. It had been published by Glenn Marco and Anne Capel in the mid-1990s in one of our exhibition catalogues, and it had been identified as coming from probably Karnak in Egypt because of the type of stone and the fact that it was some kind of curved relief or column fragment. But when we took a closer look at this recently in preparation for an exhibition, we actually found that it had some ink markings on it. So I'm just going to zoom in here. I don't know if you can see this, but at the very top of the column fragments, you can see that there is some ink writing. Can you see that? So we see the number 22 and then a line, and then 333 and then A. And the piece below that says B. So they were related to each other, and I didn't know what this meant. Was there some kind of registration number? It looks like a museum number or some kind of excavation number. So I contacted Emily Teeter, who's at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures in Chicago. She's an old friend and former colleague, and a brilliant Egyptologist. And I asked her, what do you think of this? And she said, well, maybe it's from one of the excavations going on in 1922 in Egypt. And there were really only a few at that time, and one of them was the site of Amarna. And lo and behold, she looked up in the publication from 1923, and there it was. There were our fragments actually published over 100 years ago. So it's been there already. It should have been known that this was actually the same object. But there was no record or no connection had been made here at this museum. So it really sent us on a bit of a detective hunt to see how did it get here from Egypt and from that excavation. So first of all, I contacted Stephanie Boonstra, who's at the Egypt Exploration Society. And we knew that it had been published from Amarna, and it was from an Egypt Exploration Society expedition by Pete and Woolley in 1922. And they actually have archival records available, including available online, and she shared me a link with the index cards showing that these objects, these column fragments, had been designated as part of a partage and a division arrangement. So in those days, a division was allowable between the authorities in Egypt and foreign excavation teams. And at this point, it's roughly 50-50, and they were able to have 50% or half a selection of these objects could be shipped back to England by the expedition, and the remainder would stay in Egypt. That's no longer the case today, but that's how it was in those times, over 100 years ago. And then the organizers of the expedition would send particular objects to different institutions and museums, those who had already maybe given a donation to that for the excavation. In this case, we know from the record card that it went to the St. Louis Society of the Archaeological Institute of America. And there it was shipped, along with a bunch of other objects from the same site and some other sites in the 1920s. And it went there. And I was able to gain this information from Michael Fuller, who's the secretary at the society, which is still going today. They didn't have too many records related to this, but I was then able to get some more information from him and also St. Louis Art Museum, or SLAM. Their archivists there gave me records that allowed me to reconstruct what had happened with this piece and a series of other pieces. So what we found was that the St. Louis Society owned these objects, but they'd been stored in the basement of the Art Museum in St. Louis for many years, actually about nearly 40 years, actually. And there was a decision because they were taking up quite a bit of space and they weren't really of displayable quality. I love our piece very much, but for standards of some art museums, perhaps it wasn't quite up to the standard, and so it was kept in the basement, that there would be a sale of these objects. So these objects were then put on sale in the art museum there in 1962. This was actually a relatively common thing that museums would do in those days, but actually today it's viewed as something that's quite unethical to do because it leads to more of the marketing of ancient objects. I'm talking about antiquities here. Many of these are looted, and there's a lot of problems with the buying and selling of antiquities. So really, museums are discouraged from selling antiquities today. But back in the 1960s, it was quite acceptable. It seems that an antiques dealer locally in St. Louis by the name of Claude Lynn purchased a group of objects that was not sold at that public sale. And he was then, we know from our records as well, that Claude Lynn had contacts with Walter Farmer, who was also collecting art at that time. So we don't have the clear link between Claude Lynn and this object and Walter Farmer, but we can suppose it's very likely that at some point between 1962 and 1978, this object was sold to Walter Farmer, and it was in his home also for several years too. We also know that Walter Farmer was very interested in Amarna period art, and I'm just going to show you a couple of other, another photograph that shows you with him with the actual bust of Nefertiti in Germany in 1946. So this is one of the objects that he was able to retrieve, like from the salt mines that they were being hidden in, and get it back into the German museum, the authorities of the German museums. So he had a very close affinity to Amarna period art, and that's what maybe one of the reasons why he also was interested in this particular piece. I also want to give you some information about what this object can now tell us, which is interesting, is that we know from it that, and from the publication as well, that it came from a column that was probably about 12 or 13 feet in height, maybe a bit taller. But you can see here the part of the scene that this belongs to. Let's just zoom in there. You can see the whole scene. There you go. And the sort of size and color, you've got a lot of colors in here. There is actually some traces of reds and blues in here. So each of these little striations here underneath would have been filled with a kind of paste, a colored paste. So it would have been very colorful in ancient times. And we can probably work out something about where it actually came from. We know that it came from a building that was within a complex called the Maru Aten, which was the precinct of the southern pool, which is a couple of miles south of this ancient city of Amarna, Akhenaten. So we know that it came from this building here, and it's one of those columns that it came from. And maybe we'll be able to work out which set of columns this may have come from, because there are larger and smaller ones here. So we might be able to do something about that. But now it's in a museum, and we know where it's come from. This object is available for study and research, and it can be traced back to an actual archaeological site and a published record about its discovery. So I just wanted to share that with you. I hope you've enjoyed this spotlight tour about this object, and please feel free to visit our website and find out more about our collection. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.